A study by Afrobarometer carried out before the July unrest shows that South Africans' trust in a variety of institutions was at its lowest. Subsequent to the violent riots and looting in Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, trust in elected government representatives would have dipped even lower. The Afrobarometer team in South Africa, led by the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation and Plus 94 Research, interviewed 1,600 adults in May and June. And to find out what their research was based on, we're joined by Mikhail Musa, who's a public opinion and policy researcher at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. Good evening to you, Mikhail, and thank you so much for your time this evening. Let's talk about some of these institutions that were at the receiving end of dwindling trust with members of the public, especially when it comes to just looking at how this was done so closely to what then became the riots in July.
Yes, thanks for having me. So the Afrobarometer survey is from this year is actually the 8th survey that Afrobarometer has conducted in South Africa. So we've been conducting public opinion surveys over the last 20 years in many different African countries, including South Africa. So this is a regular part of public opinion profiling work that we do in order to give citizens a voice in public policy making. So one of the key questions that we want to ask South Africans and Africans in all the different other surveys is how much do they trust their public institutions? Because public trust is a sort of measure of how well people think services are functioning, what they think of their democracy. So we ask a variety of different institutions. We don't just ask about elected leaders. We ask about the media, the police. In this instance, we asked about the health department. And what we find is that overall trust in all these institutions is actually quite low, very low at the moment, but also that over time, South Africans' trust in a variety of public institutions has declined over the last decade. And this is sort of linked to various other issues such as corruption, slow economic growth. Just this week, we saw the unemployment figures come out where people don't see their socioeconomic circumstances changing, so they don't feel that public institutions are representing their interests.
When you look at a department like the Department of Health, which is critical during this particular time, let's then look at what some of those who were really voicing their views around it were saying. Did the digital vibes scandal at all find its way to top of their minds?
So yes, so the health department actually scored quite well in our survey, but of course it's important to remember that this was in May and the earlier part of June. So pretty much just before the digital vibe scandal was breaking in the media, and of course subsequently investigation by the Hawks. The survey also was well before the resignation of Minister Zweli Mkhize, so none of this would have been factored in. But I think an important thing to keep in mind is that the Department of Health did have quite a high degree of trust before these corruption scandals, even considering the sort of PPE tender scandals that happened last year. I think the prominence of the Department of Health in managing the pandemic and informing people about COVID-19 has led to quite a high degree of trust in South Africans.
And when one looks at oversight bodies like Parliament, because one of the things that we saw in the State Capture Commission of Inquiry, it became apparent that they were not as functional and haven't been as functional as they should have been in curbing what is now known as state capture. Are people convinced that enough oversight is being conducted here?
So that's a really critical point that you touch on there. And I think the rating for Parliament, the trust rating that we find from the latest survey, indicates that people have very little faith in Parliament as an oversight institution, which of course is sort of backed up by some of the revelations in the State Capture Commission. But what essentially we find is that over the last decade, this trust has declined. So prior to about 2011, trust in Parliament, in the President, was actually relatively high. Most South Africans did trust these institutions. But after 2011, this really declined. So if we cast our minds back to what was happening at this point, this was the sort of the beginning of the Nkandla scandal being broken through the media, the rise of Thuli Madonsela, prominence as the public protector in going after corruption in the public sector. Of course, this was also the first term in office for the economic freedom fighters who really brought parliament to larger public prominence. So oversight institutions are scoring very poorly at the moment, not just parliament, but courts as well. We've seen an alarming decline in trust in courts, the public protector, which I've mentioned. So since Thuli Madonsela has left office and been replaced by Advocate Busisiwe Mkhwebane, we find that levels of trust in the public protector are much lower than they were previously. So I think the decline in these trust for institutions sort of speaks to the fact that many South Africans think perhaps that corruption can go out unabated, and that there's a degree of immunity that certain officials have, and that oversight bodies are just simply not up to standard when it comes to curbing down on corruption and mismanagement.
Why would you say then that, those that you're speaking to appear to really be saying that, their trust in the president is dwindling? What are some of the reasons that they're putting forward here?
So yes, so trust in the president is, as you say, is quite low. Compared to the last survey that we conducted in 2018, the results are actually quite similar. So even though when President Ramaphosa was elected by Parliament in 2018, there was a sort of degree of goodwill, Ramaphosa, if you will, but this didn't really translate into many more people trusting him than his predecessor as well. So unfortunately, we don't have the precise reasons that people think that they don't trust the president, but we have to assume that this is sort of linked to his inability to stamp out corruption in the way that he said he would, and also to just bring about more substantive improvements in people's socioeconomic circumstances. So we know that unemployment is increasing, poverty is still exceptionally high. Of course, the COVID crisis has not helped any of this, but even before, I think there was a sort of sense of frustration that things are not changing as much as people had anticipated. And that's really the story of the last 15, 20 years of democratic governance in South Africa, where people have quite a lot of expectation that leaders will be able to introduce reforms that will improve the lives of the majority. But sadly, of course, this is not happening quickly enough for a lot of people, and this is where the dissatisfaction comes from.
Is the trust shifting towards opposition parties?
This is a really interesting finding that we have from the survey, where in 2011, for example, about 60% of South Africans said they had quite a lot or somewhat a degree of trust in the ANC, but this has fallen all the way to 27% into 2021. So I think trust in the ANC is pretty much halved in the last decade, and this is sort of borne out in their election results, their vote share. But the most interesting thing about this is that when people lose trust in the ANC, they don't seem to want to trust opposition parties anymore. And when they don't vote for the ANC, instead of voting for other parties, often they just don't participate in elections at all. So opposition parties still only have a very small degree of trust amongst the national population, only slightly less than the ruling party. But you would have imagined that in the absence of trust in the ruling party, that opposition parties would have been boosted over the last 10 years. But this is really not the case. So what we're seeing is that people are more likely to sort of check out of democracy, of not participating, of sort of being quite distrustful of all institutions, rather than seeing an attractive alternative in the opposition. But it also speaks to perhaps the weakness of the opposition to develop a national and coherent message to appeal to all South Africans, rather than to just narrow constituencies as well.
I wonder what then this will mean when you look at your survey for the upcoming local government elections.
Yeah. So, I mean, the upcoming elections are absolutely critical for a number of reasons. And I think a key reason for this would also be what we've seen over the last few elections is declining voter turnout. So we know that most people in South Africa are young. As more and more young people are becoming eligible to vote, we are just seeing that there are so many people who are not registered on the voters' roll. So what we're getting is a less and less representative idea of what people are thinking if people are not willing to participate in elections. And of course, even those who are registered with the IEC are not wanting to vote for many parties as well. So if we have to look at the 2019 national election results, the ANC actually only got about 10 million votes, which is a very small number if you think about the number of adults in South Africa. So what we're seeing, I think, is more and more people not opting to participate in elections. And this is something that the IEC and government as a whole, political parties, of course, have to address, is they have to motivate people to have their say in elections, to get registered, and better voter education as well, because this is really one of the few opportunities that people have to participate. But I think the fact that people are choosing not to speaks to the despondency that so many people experience in South Africa today.
And I'm very interested in this particular finding when it comes to your survey. It looks like the public protector has some kind of backing.
Yes, yeah. So there is a small, or I shouldn't say a small, there is a substantive degree of support for the public protector. I think over the last decade, people have seen the value of the office of the public protector, someone with a legal background who is able to provide oversight over public finances, who is able to go after allegations of corruption. This is something, of course, that South Africans would support. But what we see over the last two rounds of surveys, so between 2018 and 2021, is that less people are trusting the public protector now than they were a few years before that. And I think that has to do with the sort of prominence of Thuli Madonsela versus her successor, Busisiwe Mkhwebane. So Advocate Mkhwebane, of course, has had various troubles with the court, various disagreements with political parties of all colors as well. So I think people, when they see that this is happening, they have somewhat less trust in this oversight institution than perhaps they did before. And also considering the scale of state capture and what has been revealed at the Zondo Commission over the last few years, I think people are also looking at what's happening and seeing that very little is being done about this.
All right. Thank you so much for those insights. That was the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation's public opinion and policy researcher, Mikhail Musa.